Good evening. My name is Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs. I'm the Director of Research here at the Agnon House. It's so nice to see so many of you, particularly as there's some of you I've seen on those little squares on my computer screen over the past 2-3 years. And it's nice to reunite in person after so long. To gather here at Beit Agnon to talk about the legacy of Jewry in Ukraine. On the actual anniversary is too chagigi a word, it's too festive a word to say anniversary, as we mark 1 year to this tragic war that has been unfolding in that territory. Now, I don't presume to know much about your family trees, but I guess there aren't that many of us who would raise their hand and say, I have no historical connection to the territory that today is called Ukraine. Everybody has somebody. Maybe it was your parent. Maybe it was you. I mean, there's at least one person I know that comes from the old country, Alta Heim. But if it wasn't your parent or your grandparent or your Elta Babi and Zaidi, we all have somebody in the family tree that goes back to what today is called Ukraine. Now, of course, the territory that today is called the country, the nation that is today called Ukraine, was not always constituted with the borders that it has today. Here in Beit Agnon, we talk a lot about Galicia. Galicia is what today is Western Ukraine. Now, some of you traveled with me a couple of years ago to Galicia, to Western Ukraine, to Buchach, to Agnon's hometown, right, which you see here on these video screens. Agnon writes in this quote during a visit that he made in 1930, the only real substantive return to the old country after having left at the age of 20 in 1908. He walks around the cities of Galicia in 1930 and he writes to a friend back here in Yerushalayim, it seems to me that the people here, both the Jews and the non-Jews, have read my books and have come to life out of the pages. They're living their lives according to the pages of my books. But it's important to remember that the Jewry that lived there in the 1930s, just a blink of the historical eye before the events that would largely wipe out, erase the Jewish life that was there, had existed that way for centuries. And even today, these videos were filmed sometime in the last decade. There's Agnon's house on Agnona Street 5 in Buchach. And those of us, we were there together, right? Walking around the streets of Ukraine. And if you kind of crane your neck and squint your eye and ignore the fact that people are driving around in modern automobiles and carrying smartphones in their hands, you could imagine, depending upon the angle that you look, that these are the cities of Shnei Talmidei Chachamim Shahiyu B'Ireinu, Agnon's great stories, that Reb Yudel Chassid is walking around schnoring kesef, trying to raise a dowry for his righteous daughters, and all of the other great characters of that time. And of course, so much of Jewish life and literature and learning was centered in these areas, greater than Galicia, Volhynia, where Bialik comes from. Chaim Nachman Bialik, whose 150th birthday we're celebrating this season. Bialik was born 150 years ago on this past Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet fast. And here in the back corner, after the event tonight, you'll have an opportunity to take a look at it if you didn't have a chance beforehand. We have this very special exhibit of the relationship of Agnon and Bialik, their correspondence, their personal objects, the pens with which they wrote the classics of Hebrew literature, their books in rare editions with dedications that each sends to the other. These objects, many of these objects from the Bialik to Agnon side are back on loan to us from the Bialik house in Tel Aviv. And this was an area where Jewish life and literature and learning and culture was reawoken, if not revived. Because in order to revive something, it has to first be dead. And I guess that's a kind of debate about what the state of Jewish life was. But it's the Jewish life that has passed on to us in one format or another that we have and that we cherish today. It's one that we have to stand guard on, that we have to preserve. Because, like all of the classics, there's always the effort to whittle away at them, to remove them from curricula, to make them invisible in regular day-to-day life. Since I mentioned the visit to Ukraine, we had plans to go visit Ukraine again this summer, because it's been a good number of years since we were there last. But because of the events around which we are commemorating, observing, marking tonight, obviously that's not happening. Unfortunately, it looks like any time soon. But we are, and pardon the commercial break, we are taking 2 trips coming up from Beit Agnon. I'll be guiding along with others in English. One to Portugal, which is essentially already fully booked in May, and a trip to Germany. Agnon lived for a dozen years in Germany around the years of World War I and wrote very many of his books centered there. And we'll be visiting Germany together with our friend, I'm sure many of you know him, Dr. David Bernstein of Pardes. We'll be traveling in Germany at the beginning of August. So anybody that's interested in that, there's information at the desk. But we're here today to really take note of the really important work that our friend Sarah Jo Ben-Zvi and her team of historians and writers and editors at Skula magazine have been doing. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Skula, and if you're not a subscriber, by the end of the evening you will be. In the most recent issue of the English edition, we get a special offering on writings about Jews in Ukraine. Now, this, Sarah Jo, this was not a coincidence.
No.
This was an opportunity to take rip something from the headlines and to try to put it into a historical context. And those of you that are readers of Segula understand what a fine job they do of navigating between scholarship and writing which is accessible to all of us, and to make the issues and challenges and events of Jewish history both accessible to readers today, as well as to try to frame them in a way that reminds us of exactly how important it is that we engage in ongoing study of Jewish history. And of course, this very, very fine article about that Nobel Prize winner, there's the Nobel Prize, that Nobel Prize winner, Shai Agnon, who if you visit Buchach today, they're very proud of Agnon. Now, there's not a single Jew left in Buchach. There's not a single Jew living there. There are a lot of Jewish tourists that pass through. There's not a single Jew left in Buchach. But they're very proud of their local Ukrainian author who won the Nobel Prize. There was a Ukrainian poet who won.
Not only Agnon, Wiesenthal was born in Buchach.
No, there were lots of. Thank you, Dr. Zurat, for reminding us that there were lots of important Jews that came from Buchach. Sigmund Freud's grandparents, the grandfather, was for a little town. It has a lot to be proud of. But they're particularly proud of. There's no statue to Simon Wiesenthal in Buchach, unless I'm mistaken.
No, I have no idea.
But they're very proud of what they call the Ukrainian author who won the Nobel Prize in literature. Now, this is, of course, difficult on many counts. Number one, Agnon was not Ukrainian by any measure, meaning there was no nation called Ukraine when he last lived there in 1908 to give citizenship by that name. Second of all, he could not have written a single sentence in the Ukrainian language with which to win a Nobel Prize in literature. Maybe besides a couple of words here and there to deal with something in the marketplace, he had no facility in the Ukrainian language. Hardly any at all in Polish, right? He spoke Yiddish and Hebrew and German. But nevertheless, when we consider Agnon and Ukraine, and we think about the horrors that are being visited there today, it's important to remember that in most of his stories, of course, the collected works are vast. So anybody that tells you Agnon never this or Agnon always that will always be caught up in his own fiction, because there ain't no such thing. But very, very often in Agnon's writing, you see something interesting. He's quite soft with the non-Jews. Of course, there are depictions here and there, not too many, of the Holocaust. There's no way to dance around that. There's no way to tiptoe around that. There are, of course, depictions of pogroms that were visited from time to time on the population. Can't ignore that. But Agnon is not a historian. He's an author of modern literature, of imaginative literature, even when it's set in a very, very, very distinct historical time and place. And when he does that, he's much more often going to be found criticizing the Yidden, the Jews. Because often the Jews were their own worst enemy. And for the purposes of literature, for the artistic purposes, that sometimes produces a much more interesting and rich cut into life long ago. And you see that also in what we're experiencing now. Now, in a few minutes, Natan Sharansky is going to be here. Now, if there's any Jew in the world who literally needs no introduction, I think it's Natan Sharansky, a child of Donetsk, which is, of course, very much in the news. And he'll speak about what he'll speak about. And in a moment, Sarah Jo will give her own angle on it. But the idea that Agnon leaves Buchach at around the age of 20, and like so many other great authors, we should note, maybe all great authors, certainly all great 20th century authors, he is so rooted in a particular place that although he leaves, it never leaves him. You can take the boy out of Buchach, but you cannot take the Buchach out of the boy. Which, of course, can be said about Mark Twain, who writes his stories of the Mississippi while living in New York. It can be said about James Joyce, who spends that long day in Dublin while in Italy. It can be said about Philip Roth, another Galicianer, who was no longer living in the Weequahic section of Newark when he wrote those stories. You can take the boy out of Buchach, but you can't take the Buchach out of the boy. In a very, very deeply autobiographical novel, but nevertheless a work of fiction called A Guest for the Night, Oreach Natal Alun, the book which was singled out for praise in the Nobel Prize citation, the book which takes that one nostalgic homecoming visit in 1930, which actually lasted only a number of days, but which in the novel gets spun out to almost a year-long visit back to the old hometown of not Buchach, but known by its literary name, Shibush. Before the war, Agnon satirizes his town, Buchach, by calling it Shibush, which means, of course, muddled, mixed up, broken down. After the war, he ceases to use that name because he's too busy trying to memorialize it. And the guest, this guest, now what does it mean to be a guest in your hometown? Most of us are olim here. I mean, some of us have been here a long time, some a little bit less. Right? Anybody not born outside of Israel? All of us. We are all of us. Right? There's about 80 people here. Not a single one of us was born in Israel. But we feel so deeply rooted. This is our home, of course. But you know what? We also have another home. And if you go back to wherever you came from, Brooklyn, who's from Brooklyn originally? Right? You can always count on that. But wherever you came from, you're also at home. What does it mean to be a guest in your own home? it means to be alienated from your own identity, to be separated from your own roots. It's surrealistic. It's one of the ways that Agnon was correctly compared to Kafka. The guest goes back to Shibush, to Buchach, and he's fascinated by the cemetery. Now, this visit takes place in 1930. After World War I, Buchach was very, very much decimated. And he's fascinated by the cemetery. The whole town is breaking down. The only public work which is being built up is the road out to the cemetery. Because it's being used so much, you understand, they needed to repave it. The midwives are out of work because no children are being born. The grave diggers are working overtime. It's a portrait of European Jewry in descent. The novel, you would think I was making this up, but I'm not. The novel was published the first week of September 1939. There were other things going on in the world at that point. And the kind of prescient idea of where European Jewry was going, you almost think there's something prophetic going on here. So he meets an old friend, the guest meets an old friend, and with this I'll end. His friend Schutzling. And he says, the guest says, it's the tragedy of my life that I don't live in Shibush, that I'm not back here on Ukrainian soil, says Schutzling to the guest. They've both left town and they reunite on this visit. And the guest replies to Schutzling, who's so nostalgic about their old Altaheim, do you love Shibush so much, said I? When a man sees that there is no place in the world that he loves, he deceives himself into thinking he loves his town. And you, do you love Shibush? I, says the guest, says the narrator, haven't thought about it yet. My friend took my hand and said, if so, let me tell you that all of your love for the land of Israel comes to you from Shibush. Because you love your town, you love the land of Israel. And how do you know that I love Shibush, says the guest. Is it proof you want, says Schutzling. If you did not love Shibush, would you be dealing with it all of your life? Would you be digging up gravestones to discover its secrets? Sadly, there are very, very, very many gravestones in Ukraine. Many of our ancestors are buried under them. And sadly, this year, until now, according to some estimates, there are another 250,000 who probably are not lying yet under gravestones. And it's part of the great tragedy of all of the history of that place, to which all of us are somehow or another connected. And it's part of the great tragedy of what's going on there in this year that makes us turn our attention to it once again. Sarah Jo Ben-Zvi is responsible for so many wonderful things in our community in Efrat and at the Skula magazine, which we again commend to your attention. I'll turn it over to Sarah Jo, and then she will after introduce NATAN SHARANSKY.
Is it possible to move the lectern a bit to the left so we can see the feet?
You mean it was okay not to see Jeffrey, but you need to see me? So first of all, thank you, Jeffrey, very, very much for that wonderful welcome.
Microphone
Microphone is not.
Thank you.
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you for that wonderful introduction, for that very warm welcome. It's amazing for me to be in Bet Agnon. It's such a wonderful environment to welcome people into. It was actually a brainwave that I suddenly thought, maybe we're going to change the order of events a little bit. As Natan is Natan is here.
Thanks.
Okay, so I think that... No? Oh, okay. was a brainwave that came to me when we produced this beautiful issue on Ukraine, which is actually not a beautiful issue. You can't talk about Ukraine in terms of beauty in the sense of the Jewish history of Ukraine, because there are so many shadows and so many dark parts of that history, and at least half of the issue that we put together is on the dark side of the Jewish history of Ukraine in the 20th century. And there are dark shadows before that as well. And Ukraine is experiencing another dark shadow now, although in fact every time there is a dark shadow that afflicts the Jews of Ukraine, it's a period of lawlessness. It seems that when everything breaks down, those are the times when the Jews of Ukraine suffered more than anybody else. I very much wanted to shift the spotlight, at least for part of this issue, to the bright lights of the Jewish history of Ukraine. And Agnon House is a wonderful example. And there are very many bright lights of Jewish history, and it's essentially, as Jeffrey said, the revival of the Jewish language and the beginning of Zionism has its roots in Ukraine, in the Chovevei Zion, Chibat Zion movement, which began there more than anywhere else, and preceded Herzl, and which looked at Herzl as a newcomer on the scene of the dreams of rebuilding Zion and renewing the language. This issue starts with a wonderful article by SHARANSKY about the classic profession of the Jews of Ukraine. What do you think of as a classic Jewish profession? What do we think? We think intellectuals, lawyers, accountants. What is it in Ukraine? Forget doctors and lawyers. The most Jewish profession in the world, historically, is bartending. Anyone trekking across Ukraine, across central Poland, to the Dnipro River in the 18th and 19th century, knew whom to look for when seized by a sudden thirst. The Jew behind the bar in one of thousands of taverns along the way. For some 200 years, spirits were an almost exclusively Jewish line of work, especially in non-urban areas. And roughly a third of Eastern European Jewry, which was then more than half the global Jewish population, was either directly or indirectly involved in distilling, bottling, merchandising, or serving alcohol. Now, I wanted to bring the second half of the Bet Agnon is now celebrating the conjunction of Agnon and Bialik. And I thought to myself, this is a perfect opportunity for me to showcase Bialik in Bet Agnon, because there is a very, very poignant poem by Bialik, which he wrote towards the end of his life. As you were saying, when does an author relive his roots? Not in the beginning of his life, when those roots are young and new, but more and more towards the end of his life, as those roots develop and produce fruit. So Bialik, towards the end, really towards the end of his life, 2 years before he died, wrote an amazing poem about his father. And Bialik's father was a perfect example, I would say, of nearly all the Jewish professions of Ukraine, because he literally slid down the slippery slope from relative comfort to poverty, and he began his life as his adult life, his professional life, working a lumber concession, which his father rented from the landowner of this very small village near Zhytomyr, which Bialik calls Radi, and which in fact, according to his birth records, was a place called Izricha. So, like, which is which and where is something that we don't really know. So his father began as essentially a lumber merchant. But how did it work? The peasants paid their landowner not in money but in goods. And somebody was responsible for taking those goods and turning them into money. And that was usually a Jew who was the go-between, moving concessions moving commodities into money, into currency. And then handing it over to the landowner, that was what he wanted. So Bialik's father started off in lumber, and he didn't do too well, and he ended up having to hand back the concession and move from the village where Bialik started out life to a small suburb of Zhytomyr, where eventually he opened a tavern. Because another one of the big commodities that Jews dealt in, or that Ukraine is famous as the world's breadbasket. But at this point in time, there were many other sources of wheat suddenly coming onto the world market. Russia was developing further east and further north, and so Russian grain was competing with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth grain, and America was beginning to export grain to Europe. And suddenly, the Polish landowners were finding themselves with literally what the Europeans have complained for years about their butter mountain. So the Polish noblemen were complaining about their grain mountain. And whereas until that point, turning grain into spirits had been a relatively slow and expensive process, at this time the chemical improvements in distillation meant that it could become something very fast and very cheap. And what better to do with your grain mountain than turn it into something that instead of has to be eaten, something that can be drunk. And instead of something which has to be sent abroad because you have so much of it for somebody else to buy, can be absorbed by the very people who grow it. And who is it who can be trusted to hand on this product without consuming too much of it themselves? Because there was a legend, how true it was, I don't know, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in the Pale of Settlement, in the Ukraine, that Jews don't drink. Certainly, maybe all it meant was that Jews drank less. But the concessions for alcohol were competed for in every village, and they could go to the local priest, they could go to one of the younger sons of a noble family, or they could go to a Jew. And generally speaking, the nobility preferred the Jew because he could extract more, he could pressurize more, he could gain more if the go-between converting grain to vodka to cash was actually a Jew. So this became the prime Jewish occupation in the area. That's not to say that there were not many other Jewish occupations, but this really became thought of as the realm of the Jew. And nobody likes to owe money. Nobody likes it when it comes time to pay your tab. And the Jew who stood behind the counter of the local tavern And usually in the villages, the tavern was like an extension of the nearest shtetl. The shtetl was a small town, and the villages were even smaller. And the services of the shtetl were brought into the village by visiting tradesmen. The one permanent fixture of the shtetl, which could be found in the village, was the tavern, owned by a Jewish family. And that Jewish family was fairly isolated. They didn't have any of the backup, the infrastructure that you would have in the shtetl. There's no permanent cheder, there's no shochet, no base medrash, no shul. Everything is the family on their own. And Bialik, at the time that his family lived in the village, describes it as an idyllic paradise. Here before me, on this backdrop of blue skies and green grass, are embroidered the pictures of my world in those first days. Wonderful pictures, light and serene as pure mists, half secrets and half dreams, and nevertheless no scenes as bright and clear as they are, nor any reality as real. These are my soul's basic elemental scenes, bestowed upon me freely from the skies, a gift of God and His goodness. I was little and tender and left to myself. Like a forsaken fledgling, I wandered alone about my nest. My father and mother left me to myself, and there was no one else to look after me. Then God in His mercy took me under the shelter of His wings and allowed me to sit quietly at His footstool and play gently with the fringes of His garment. So Bialik describes the village as a paradise with none of the characteristic limitations of the Jewish community. It's the family, Bialik himself, with nature, the beauty of the area, and his God. And it's a setting in which the location etches itself into the soul of the Jewish child, and he feels that it grants him a special intimacy with his God. And then Bialik's family move with this deterioration, and they move to Zhitomir, to a rundown part of a rundown suburb of the town. And he describes how his father spends his days standing behind the counter of the bar in this rundown, broken, poor, grey neighborhood. And he describes an almost, you used the term Kafka before, an almost Kafkaesque picture of how he sees his father's face in the steaming environment of the tavern, almost divorced from his body. It's like as if there's a total alienation here. And he said, by the way, the translation I read before was from a Toby Press translation of Bialik's book, Random Harvest. And this is from Selected Poems of Bialik, translated by Ruth Neville. And in this poem, Bialik, looking back from Tel Aviv, towards the end, at the age of 59, 2 years before his death, sees again his father in this difficult environment, and he describes him as, silent between his knees I stood, my eyes fixed to his moving lips. Around us heaved hubbubs of drunkards, flood of obscene speech, vomiting sots and monstrous dissolute faces. The very walls blanched at the sounds. The blinds covered the window's face. My ear alone, a child's untainted ear, caught the soft stream of whispered syllables from my father's lips. Pure prayer and law, the word of the living God. My father was not blessed with length of days. While I was but a child, unsated still by sight of fatherly face, while mine called forth paternal pity, and my head declaimed his protecting hands, death summoned him, and endless separation severed us. There are so many disjointed moments in this poem. There's the face of Bialik's father, the pious, saintly face of Bialik's father, the scholar who has to go out every day. Bialik describes him in this poem like an egla arufa, like a beheaded ox of Sefer Dvarim, or like an ox chained to pull the wagon of his days. Every day he has to leave behind the prayer house where he begins his day with shacharit, with talit and tefillin, and walk into this hubbub of drunken dissolution and serve the customers all day. And beneath the counter, hidden from their eyes, is a volume of the Mishnah, and his lips all through the day murmur the words, and only Bialik hears it. And you have this complete contrast between Bialik's early childhood, where he associates nature with the relationship with God, and an intimate ability to talk to God and be one with God, and the alienation of the Jew in the non-Jewish environment, completely divorced. Bialik's father's head and the book beneath the counter, and in between is the smoke and of the pipes and the steam of the boiling kettles, and the foam of the glasses of the vodka, and the breath, everybody's breath in this warm environment with the cold outside, and it's as if one is floating above all the rest. And this contrast between the Jewish inner life and the harsh experience of the outer life is something which we find, I think, also in this poem of Bialik's, in some of the writing of Agnon, and that we ask ourselves when we look at what's at Ukraine today. And for this, I'm about to introduce NATAN SHARANSKY, who needs no introduction. How is it that a place which, on the one hand, was so inhospitable, so murderous to the Jews who had no choice to call this part of the globe home, is now led and following someone of Jewish descent? How is that? What is the relationship today between Ukraine and its Jews? How has that happened? Is it a flash in the pan? Is it like the beginning of the independent Ukraine between World War I and World War II, which was very briefly hospitable and open to Jews and run by Jews? Or is it something that can be relied on, something which might grow, something which might remain? So I'd like to introduce to you and give the floor to NATAN SHARANSKY.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, dear friends, I'm glad to be here, though I have to say I'm here almost by mistake. because the one who was invited was my daughter. And I think she really, her English and her literary talent, I can't compete with her. But she said that I'm not specialist in Ukraine, maybe you'll invite my father. They said, can you invite my father? So I cannot say no to my daughter. Okay. If my remarks will be not exactly to the point, it's blame my daughter. If they will be I have to say that from the very first day of brutal aggression of Russia, which in 2 days there will be first anniversary of this war, I spoke publicly on different shows, and whoever wanted to hear me, that Israel has that's not struggle about the piece of land, that's the struggle about the future of the free world, because Putin wants really to change all the order, to rebuild Russian empire, and so that's why we have to be with Ukraine in the struggle. And then that first day I discovered that I'm in minority of one on that panel, and until the very last times it was really that I was in absolute minority. Even today I think I'm still in minority, but situation started changing really in the last month. If somebody saw today's editorial in Jerusalem Post that we have to start giving defensive weapons to Ukraine, it's something for the first time in Israel press. But I was always, first of all, I was challenged by the fact that we have special interest to have good relations with Putin because of Syria, but that's not our topic today. But the other question, which only a few days ago I was challenged in New York, saying that one woman said, I agree with all your logical arguments, but I'm the survivor of the Holocaust. And I know very well what Ukrainians did to us. And we know the history of what Ukrainians did to us. How I can now be supportive of Ukraine? And I'll tell you what I told her, if it is not exactly the topic, but then we'll move to Zelensky. Yeah. So, first I said, of course I know very well, not only because of history of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, though, by the way, Bogdan Khmelnytsky is not the hero of Ukrainian nationals, it's the hero of Russian Empire, those who know history, but that's different. But we know what were pogroms of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, we know what was in the times of Petlura, and we know and I'm the chairman of the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial in Kiev, so of course we know it. But you probably, those of you who traveled to Spain, could see Ferdinand and Isabella just in your eyes in the center in different cities, and I don't want to tell you what they exactly did. Those of you who enjoyed, as I enjoyed, Provence in France, have to know that at the times of Crusaders, practically all the communities there were killed. You enjoy Alps in Switzerland, the whole communities were burnt alive because of the plague. They thought that they are saving themselves from the plague by burning the Jews. So as I said, that if we really want to build our relations on what they did to us, we should better find another planet. Because there is no place for us here, or we don't want to see all of them here. And in Bible, in fact, thanks to my daughter, I know that in Bible, in that chapter when Abraham sends Agar and Ishmael, and they are in desert, and some they are almost dying from thirst, and God helps them and say to Agar what to do. And then in Rashi, and probably some others are writing that sages say that the angels challenge the God. You know what they'll do to us. Why are you saving them? And God said, at this moment, is he guilty or innocent? They said innocent. So I judge people at this moment. So what happens at this moment? Well, Putin said that they are all neo-Nazis. That neo-Nazis, when they tried to succeed in elections, they didn't get 1%, that they didn't get 0.1%. There is no other country in Europe at this moment where neo-Nazis will be so unsuccessful in their attempts to have influence as in Ukraine. Ukraine, I think, is the first country in Europe and maybe in the world where on very tough elections, free elections, there were two Ukrainian candidates and one Jewish. And he is not of some of decent origin, as some others say. He is Jew, who is very proud. Well, he is not religious Jew, but he is very proud to speak about his Jewishness. He almost went on Na'aleh to Israel. He is very fond of Israel. He always speaks about the great Jewish culture and how it is important for Ukraine. He is very open, all his life, he is very openly Jewish. In the free elections, he was elected in tough competition with the Ukrainian candidates. What it means, not because they loved Jews, because it didn't really matter. The fact that he was Jewish and didn't matter to overwhelming majority. And at this moment, I don't say that Ukrainians wanted it, that it was their aim, but it so happened by history that they are in the very middle of the struggle for the future of the free world. And I think the free world has to be very happy and lucky that they are not asking the soldier, they are asking only for weapons to defend all of us from Putin's attempts to rebuild different type of Europe, the different type of world, which was to take us 100 years ago. So, historically, now in my life, how it happened, why Ukraine, with all its awful history, is so friendly to Jews. I have to say, I was born in Donetsk, then it was Stalin, and then after this Donetsk, which is today the center of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and there were a lot of nationalities there. And there were, of course, there were Russians and Ukrainians and Tatars and Georgians and so on. But it was all non-important because nationals of all the kinds was, Soviet Union was against nationals. The only thing which was really important, if an idea of your parents is written Jew. Because then there is a lot of discrimination, everybody knows that everybody is told to be Jew is like to be born with some very big disease. And all what we wanted is to run away from our Jewishness because there was nothing positive, we were absolutely assimilated. So now, from time to time we heard about some Ukrainian nationals. But it seemed like strange, what Ukrainians, they are not discriminated, they can go to the university, nobody will stop them. They can make any career, they can be the head of the hospital, the head of the fabrica, what Jews could not. So, nationality as nationality didn't mean anything. There was no point. So Ukrainians are like Russians. And we were celebrating from the age of 6, I was 6 when there was celebration of 300 years of volunteer reuniting of Russia with Ukraine. And that's when Bogdan Khmelnytsky brought Ukraine to Russia. And it was so natural that it's almost the same, Ukrainians and Russians both. Then when, after 67, Israel and then Judaism entered our life, first in the underground and then in real life, and they were becoming nationalists, and they were becoming also, with the time I became also human rights activists. So I dealt a lot also with Ukrainian nationalists. I was one of the founding members of Helsinki Group, where the other Helsinki Group was created in Kiev, and they came to us, and I was helping them to meet journalists. And for the first time, I had really very serious conversations with Ukrainian democratic nationalists who were explaining me how they see the history of Ukraine, how Russia enslaved them, and how, of course, they are very sorry about tragic relations with Jews, but they're not running away from this. Of course, they're blaming Soviet Union. So, but suddenly, you can see that if only they are Democrats like you, in fact, we have common interests, because Ukrainian nationalism and Jewish nationalism and Lithuanian nationalism and Armenian nationalism in prison, they all work together. You know that if they are nationalists like you, the chance that KGB will break them or will turn them into the informers is much less, because they have something to fight for except their life exactly as you. Of course, provided that we are all Democrats and we believe in respecting one another. So when Ukraine became independent. And by the way, it was very funny how President Bush's father was telling me that he doesn't want that Ukraine becomes independent, because Gorbachev is the guy that we rely on, how I can help him to convince Ukrainians not to be independent. And of course I said it's absolute nonsense after 300 years. Nevertheless, if you remember, he went to Kiev 1 month before they are voting to become independent, and tried to convince them in the name of the free world that they will stay with Gorbachev. Okay, of course they didn't listen to him, as all the others, and so they became independent. You have to understand that this spirit of the Ukrainian nationalists, that was the spirit of the first parliament, let's say, Ukraine, and some of these Ukrainian nationalists became very active then in the parliament. So Jews were no more their enemy. They were afraid of imperialist Russia. They were afraid of some Chechens. They were suspicious about the West, who is afraid of them. But as to Jews, they felt very comfortable. As to Israel, I can say that later, 10 years later, I became minister. We tried to negotiate with Russia and with Ukraine, not delivering technologies to Iran. Already in 1996, 1997, it was impossible. Russia, there was nobody to talk to. They said France can trade with Iran and we cannot. Ukrainians, then it was President Kuchma, were the first to agree with us. So, and they stopped, they cancelled the centrifuges for the first Iranian reactor. And they really believed, I believe they were saying it, that Israel is something that we can learn a lot, because how to be independent country among the enemies. And of course they started remembering that Ukraine, it was not only the crimes, it is the motherland of all the Hasidut, and suddenly it became popular. They started opening the monuments to great Ukrainian Jews or Jewish Ukrainians, whatever. Suddenly, not only Bialik, but they found so many Ukrainians discovered as Jews. They were surprised, and Jewish communities, of course. Chabad got a lot of free hand, and Dnipropetrovsk became, I think, by far the biggest Jewish center in the world. Why they need such a big center, I don't know, but because 3 of the 4 biggest oligarchs in Ukraine happen to be from Dnipropetrovsk, so they built this unbelievable place. No, but nobody in the government, even in the, not only in Zelensky government, in all those 5 governments that you have to understand, in the 22 years there were 5 presidents. In Russia at the same time was only 1 president. And that's, by the way, the main difference. There are oligarchs, there is corruption, they're all the same in Ukraine and Russia. But the difference is there were 5 presidents, people accuse the president of corruption, they go to the demonstration and they go to vote, and in free vote another wins. 2 years after this, they accuse him of corruption. So, but that is a big difference. They go to vote. And Jews were never, in these years, Jews were never a problem for them. They have other enemies to fight for. And Jews, in fact, Jews, it's Israel, and Israel is so good and so on. Coming to these days, I have to say, there is huge disappointment among the leadership. When I met Zelensky 2 months ago, he said to me, look, I tell you frankly, for me, as a Jew, and as a leader of Ukraine, I cannot explain to myself, not speaking about the others, how it is that in all the free world, there are only 2 countries who refuse to give us weapons. It's Hungary and Israel. And of course I give all the reasons. So, by the way, I think it's finishing now because of the simple reason. Because Iran, our biggest enemy, is becoming the biggest ally of Putin. Because until now, there was a very strange situation. There is America, which sees, not Europe, which sees Putin as number 1 enemy, and try to appease Iran at the same time. And we see Iran as number 1 enemy and try to appease Russia. It was a very natural situation, but all our people responsible for our defense were explaining why we cannot. I hope it's changing. But Now, I'm asked very often, will there be anti-Semitism in Ukraine? I got to say, the chances are much bigger than there will be anti-Semitism in Russia. And I'll explain to you. Well, of course, this disappointment in Israel, it has tactical reasons, and I hope it will pass away. But among Ukrainians, you see a lot of sympathy to Jews and Israel. But in Russia, there is no anti-Semitism, mainly because, for the first time in 1,000 years, Russian leader is not only not anti-Semite, but he loves Jews. And he has his personal history. As a Democrat, I can say only very bad things about Putin. As a Jew, I can say that there is a lot of good things which he tried to do. But, as I say, this moment, there is an awful war. And I am sure that Ukraine will win this war, though, because it goes through a very difficult period. In Russia, there will be big crisis. The leaders will have to, I think some of them will be overthrown. And at the time when it is so, people are in such a crisis, there was, after all, there is a lot of prejudice against Jews, both in Russia and Ukraine, historical. But there will be the reason to play on these prejudices. And that's why I do believe that in Russia, whoever will be after Putin, or even if Putin will survive, though it's very difficult to see how he will survive this defeat, but even if he will survive, anti-Semitism again will become something which will be needed, as always it was. In Ukraine, there is, well, I don't see at this moment any reason for coming back. The anti-Semitism, they hate Russia, they hate Chechens, they have many people to hate. And at the same time, they're already building, and Zelensky speaking, but many speaking, how we have to learn from Israel and how Israel will help us even to rebuild our life. So I really don't see any external reasons that somebody will be interested to play on these prejudices. To say that these prejudices don't exist, such things don't disappear easily. But also about the other countries of Europe, I can say, if they will need anti-Semitism, they will use anti-Semitism. But simply at this moment, I can see how Russia will need anti-Semitism. I don't see how Ukraine will need. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. We're, of course, always mindful that NATAN Sharansky has done more than any other Jew in our lifetimes to remind us to fear no evil. And we're very appreciative of that. Would you take one or two questions?
Yeah.
We have time for one or two questions. Maybe we'll take 3 questions in a row, and then we'll give Natan a chance to respond. So, Franzorf, here,
yes.
Speak.
Did you in any way discuss Zelensky's speech to the Knesset? Because
he
made terrible mistakes.
Terrible mistake. He himself told me, because I said to him that it was a very stupid mistake. He said, yes. I said, who told you that? I said, don't ask. It was in the middle of battle. I had to come to speak. I did. He himself understands that if his formula is a little bit different, he didn't have to say that Ukrainians helped you during Holocaust. And by the way, before, like a few months before, there was the 80th anniversary of Babi Yar. And there was President Zelensky and President Herzog and President of Germany, I don't remember. And I was speaking, they all were speaking, I was speaking as the head of Babi Yar. We were like the host of this. And he did a brilliant speech. It was better than any other speech of those who were speaking. No, I don't have any criticism to our president, but it was easy for our president to make this speech. It was much more challenging for Zelensky. He made the brilliant speech, and he gives all the support possible to Babi Yar Museum and to other places. So the fact that in the middle of the beginning of this awful war, when every day they are bombarded, and he's irritated why the West is not giving him the weapons to protect his skies. Remember that he was speaking to American colleagues and said, close our skies, and to Europe and to Israel. How it can be that you're not... So he came in the middle of the battle, he went there, he went back when they were all arms. And he said the stupid thing. He himself told me, it was stupid, and so if you see after this, he tries to be more careful. So,
Could you tell us what he said?
he made a very good speech, but in the end he said, and this about speaking about that we are in the middle of war, fighting for the values of the West, and we need help, more or less the same speech which he did then to America and to all the world. And then in the end he said, we in Ukraine helped you in the time of Holocaust, you have to help us. By this he immediately lost everybody. Okay, it's okay. Let's say he doesn't stick to this.
There's a question in the back. Somebody raised their hand. Another question?
We answered all the questions.
We answered all.
Yeah.
Yes, last question.
This is a little bit of a tangent, but I feel you spoke about so many of our enemies, and I'm an Israeli now, but I'm also from the U.S., so I want to know just briefly what your thoughts are about China and all this list of our enemies.
Well, I think potentially China is by far the biggest threat to the free world. And we are part of the free world, so it's also to us. And I have to say that, well, all the free world is not very good in terms of moral clarity and real politics. Israel is not outstanding in this place. And our leaders believe that such a huge market, we cannot skip it. And I can tell you more than once I was with some Israeli high-tech specialists in the airplane. It was just before, if you remember, the Olympic Games in Peking. And he tells me with big pride that they are doing now a special program for Chinese, which automatically, when people will be speaking, their officials, and it also has to be broadcasted, how to make censorship from the moment of speech to the moment that it will come to me, how to make, and that it's such a great program. So, and I said to him, you don't feel it's a problem that we Israelis are helping them with the same? He said, if we will not do it, somebody else, we want such a competition. So, okay.
Thank you to NATAN Sharansky for his always clear moral voice and his lifelong leadership of so many causes that are central to our lives as Jews. Thank you to Sarah Jo Ben-Zvi and to Skula Magazine. I'm so grateful for this partnership, and I hope this is something we'll do again and again with other upcoming